Hi everyone, and welcome to the first video in this introductory series on algorithmic music in TidalCycles. My name is Clarissa Littler, and for this video, we are starting with assuming you have Tidal installed. There will be supplementary materials if you still need help getting it installed, but I'm assuming you have it ready, up and running, and to the point that you have your Super Collider instance and your Atom editor both on at the same time, and that you've at least tried to see if it works. So we're going to talk about what algorithmic music is, the general idea of what patterns are, particularly patterns for music, and then we're going to play around with some ways of describing patterns in TidalCycles in order to make different beats. So to start, let's try doing a simple 4 on the floor like bass drum. Okay, so that's just an even 4 bass drums per, it's not quite per second, it's per cycle, but we'll explain in a moment here what per cycle means. Now, in order to actually start this, I type this text and hit Control-Enter with my cursor on the line where this text starts. Now, and so we also need to talk about the second most important thing, which is how to make things stop. And there is a thing called hush, and similarly, you hit Control and then Enter to make the sound stop. And there's a way to also make sounds individually stop if you have them running through different channels, and we'll talk about that as we go. So let's break down what this line was and what it did. So we're kind of reading it. So let's start by reading it left to right. What we're saying is there's this channel called D1, and it's going to take sounds. And where the sounds come from? Well, we're generating a pattern of sounds, in this case, bass drum samples. And the name of the bass drum sample is just BD. And what we're saying here is that the thing between the quotation marks is going to be the description of the pattern. All our descriptions of patterns in TidalCycles always go between quote marks. It's almost like its own little language for making patterns. And then you feed it to this thing S that tells it that the patterns should be making sounds. So it sort of eats a pattern and then figures out that it's like, okay, this pattern that is of just characters like BD, this must be sounds. And then, can pass that along the D1 channel and then send that to Super Collider, triggering the samples, and that's how the basics of this works. So I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about what these things even are. So when I'm talking about a pattern, so patterns are things you've kind of seen all the time. You see them a lot in textiles, anything that you see them in, clothing, you see them in wallpaper, carpet, you see them in a lot of things like that. You also see them in you also see them in all sorts of places, like the lines on your notebook paper are a kind of pattern, like a really boring one, but that's a pattern. It has repetition, it has order, there's a way you can kind of describe it. And similarly, patterns show up a lot in music, and patterns in music are there's happen on a few different layers. You can think of things like a song structure that's like verse, chorus, as a kind of pattern. You can also think of the individual combination of beats and where the drums kick in is itself a sort of pattern. What's the pattern of the, say, hi-hats or something. And then kind of there's almost the sort of a medium in between thing, which is like you can think of things like melodies as or bass lines as kind of their own patterns that tend to be like a little longer over time than something like your backbeat. And in tidal cycles, what you're doing is you are writing code in specifically in the programming language Haskell, which we'll introduce Haskell as we're going through this. You don't really need to know the language to start doing tidal, but to start doing more advanced things and writing your own code that does like really cool stuff that the basic library doesn't have, then you start needing to know Haskell better. And we'll cover that sort of as we need it over the course of these videos. So what you're doing here is you're creating, writing code in Haskell that creates, that makes patterns, and then the patterns generate the music by sending signals that go to Super Collider, that other piece of software that's installed and that you need to start before you can use Tidal. And those signals, that creates the music. So you're writing code that writes patterns that writes music, is I think the best way of thinking of it. And so let's talk a bit about what patterns are and how we build them and things like that. So again, starting with this very simple beat, what we're saying is we have a pattern that's just 4 bass drums. Now, what if we also want something like hi-hats? So we're going to choose a different channel to put this on. And our hi-hat, the one I like that comes with Tidal, is the hi-hat 27 sample. And we're going to have 8 of them. So let's Control Enter on both of these to get them playing. Okay. So you can hear that the hi-hat is happening more often than the bass drum. It's happening twice as often. It's in the time that you have 4 beats of the bass drum, you actually have 8 beats of the hi-hat. And the reason why is that the cycles in TidalCycles is that there's an internal notion of what a cycle is, and patterns in Tidal are written so that it tries to do everything that you've described in a cycle, and it makes things as fast and as short as it needs to sort of cram them all together. So if we wanted to get really silly, we could have 16 hi-hats in a single cycle. And you can hear that's a lot faster. And we can also double the bass drum rate. And it sounds like, it sounds like some kind of crescendo that's happening. But the point here is that it gets faster and faster, and conversely, it also can get really slow. So if we have just 1 bass drum sample and 2 hi-hat samples in the patterns, then it will be only like roughly a cycle isn't a second. They're a little different from each other, but if you think of it kind of like 1 drum per second-ish size, you wouldn't be going wrong there. You can also kind of think of it like, if you've had a little bit of music, you can think of it as the size of your measure. A cycle and a measure are sort of roughly the same size as each other. So if you've ever had to learn an instrument and you've had to learn about like whole notes, quarter notes, eighth notes, etc., then that kind of intuition will help you here. Like if you put 4 notes in a cycle, those will be quarter notes, roughly. So if you want, the basic lesson here is that if you want faster or slower beats, then you want faster or slower, you want to have more or less things happening in a cycle. Now, having just a flat beat is actually really boring, right? And thankfully, we can make things a lot more interesting. So to start doing that, we're going to talk about how to group elements of a pattern together and how to preserve the underlying pulse of the music. When we're doing something like this, you can think of this as having a pulse of 4. And even if we have like 8 hi-hats, they're sort of lining up so that the underlying rhythm is still this pulse of 4 per cycle. And so, in order to make something more interesting, let's start by taking this expression here that's the BD times 4 to make 4 of them, and let's expand it out explicitly because this is actually equivalent to, but slower to write than this. And just to prove to you that it's the same thing, you can hear that that's the same tempo, it's the same rhythm, it's the same pattern. One is just a shorthand for the other. It's a lot easier to write HH27 times 8 than it is to write, 8 hi-hats. But here's what we're going to do. We're actually going to take each of these and we're going to make it a little more complicated. So I'm just going to tell you first off, essentially what we're doing is we're keeping the pulse of 4 because in the cycle there are 4 groups of things. Each of these things that's times 2 inside the cycle is going to be sort of grouped together so that inside the first quarter of the cycle you're going to have these 2 bass drums. Inside the second quarter you're going to have another 4 bass drum hits. In the third quarter, just 1, and in the fourth quarter, another 4. And these are not evenly spread out. It's between the, let me see how many bass drum samples is that in the entire thing? 11. It's not 11 bass drum samples spread evenly across the cycle. They're spread so that these 4 here are going to be happening twice as fast as these 2 here, and 4 times faster than this one here. That's how the subdivision is going to work. So try and picture in your head what that might mean, and then then we're going to hear it. So you can hear that that's a lot more sort of compelling of a sound than what we had before, which was just this very flat 4 bass drum hits per cycle. Now patterns, these patterns are all happening in time. And one of the first things I want to introduce is the idea that it's describing, we can actually play around with the sense of time within tidal cycles. So rather than just having something like this, well, first off, let's see what it sounds like if we have just 4 hi-hats happening along with this bass drum lick. So the hi-hats are matching up to the start of a bass drum sample happening, because they're sort of subdivided on the same ways. Now, that's okay, but that's not how. And sometimes you want music to sound like that, but sometimes you actually want it to be a little offset from each other, right? We'll have the hi-hat kicking in just a little shifted off between those quarter segments that are the underlying pulse of the bass drum. And to do that, we're going to say to Tidal, shift this pattern over in time a little bit. And to do that, we just have this function here. And so this is where I get to talk about a couple of concepts. One is, now we've had these two of these dollar signs here. And basically the way you want to read the dollar signs is you want to sort of read it right to left. You want to say the sort of innermost thing relative to the dollar signs, that's the thing that's sort of the base pattern, and then other things are transformations on it until you get to the part at the very end, a thing that starts with D, that is the, send it to Super Collider. So what we have here is, this is another transformation that happens to be built into Tidal, where you give it a time, and it shifts sort of by that fraction of a cycle. So the reason why we say an eighth of a cycle is because if the bass drum hits are always starting on a quarter cycles is when the different parts of the bass drum are happening, because that's this underlying pulse we've made, then if we shift it over by an eighth, then it'll kind of start halfway between those and sound a little offset and a little more dynamic. So let's test that out. And this is also an opportunity to share one thing that's kind of cool, which is that you can, we don't have to keep turning off the sound. We can keep going and modifying things live. This is sometimes called live coding. So here, I'm going to change this to take away the shift, and you'll hear the difference. So yeah, doesn't that feel like almost completely different to have the shift or not? It just changes the vibe of the beat, it changes the dynamism of it, and so that's an example of how we can kind of play around with senses of time. And this is a trick we're going to come back to a lot in terms of thinking of these patterns. We have 4 hi-hats per cycle, but they're just a little offset by an eighth of a cycle. Now, there's a lot of other functions we can compose to sort of operations we can shift in here to make transformations on patterns. And we're going to be learning them slowly as we go, because there's just this huge number of them, and by the end of all these videos you're going to know how to write your own so that you can keep making more and more interesting, neat music and kind of develop your own personal style doing algorithmic music in Tidal. Now, there's a few things that we want to show before the end of this video. One of them is how to have, now what we've shown you are how to have patterns that are the same every cycle. I mean, come on, that's a little on the boring side. Thankfully though, there's all sorts of ways to make patterns that differ between cycles. And so we're going to show the angle bracket syntax, and we're also going to show the question mark syntax for the making patterns. And so to start, the angle bracket syntax is a way of saying shift between these different things between cycles. So for example, if we do something like this, if we do something like this, what it means is on the very first cycle, it'll go bass drum, 4 bass drums, bass drum, 2 bass drums. The next cycle, it will go 2 bass drums, 4 bass drum, 1 bass drum, 4 bass drum. The next cycle after that, it'll go 4 bass drum, 4 bass drum, 1 bass drum, 2 bass drum. It'll just keep, you can, each of these little things that with the angle brackets, the little less than greater than sign, they're happening independently from each other, in that like when one of them gets to its end, it goes back to the beginning, even if the other one is still like marching down the line. So the fact that we have one that's 2 and one that's 3 means that they won't match up again right away, which is actually a good thing because it keeps there being more variation. So let's see how this sounds, and so that I can show you that's how it works. So you can hopefully hear that there's some variation happening between the different cycles. If we want to make it like really egregious, sound maybe a little funny, we can do things like have different drum samples instead in these parts that are varying. So now let's try. So that's my, that I think proves the point at least a little bit, that you have this variation happening across cycles. Now I'm going to change it all back to just the bass drum because we're going to, put the hi-hat back in later. And I kind of want this to feel like a consistent beat of all the same drum and keep different drums on different channels for now. And in fact, you see, I'm just going to change the order just a little bit relative to each other. And now the next thing to talk about is the question mark syntax, which is kind of cool because it's the first taste of one of the things that makes algorithmic music so special, which is randomness. Basically, you can have, so if you're writing normal music, you can't exactly have, I mean, people have done things like this, and it's all like weird experimental stuff, but you can't just normally write a piece of music and hand it to someone that has in certain parts, like you give the percussion, the percussion music to someone, and it has places where it's just like flip a coin to determine whether or not you hit the drum here, or to determine whether you're hitting the hi-hat open or closed, right? Like you can't do things like that. You can't have someone in the middle of a show stop and decide whether they're going to, which thing they're going to hit on the drum kit. But with a computer and algorithmic music, you can start to have randomness, and deciding whether or not you hit something is exactly what the question mark does. And the question mark does some kind of fun stuff where it more or less says, okay, it modifies another pattern and says all the events in this pattern, give them a 50% chance of happening or not. So just a coin flip, right? And let's call heads means that the drum hit happens. So every time this event in the middle here with the 4 bass drum hits happens, now the question mark says that for each one of those, it's going to flip a coin, and if it comes up heads, you play the sample and play just silence in that space instead if it comes up tails. And which means you're expecting, what's 50% of 4? That means 2. You're expecting 2 of those bass drum hits to happen on average for each cycle. But which 2? You're not sure. And sometimes you'll have where it's just none of them hit, and sometimes all 4 of them will hit, and it will sound like it did before we put in the question mark. So let's just give this a listen for a little bit to see how it is. I'm going to take out the other question mark just to make it a little more clear there's only one where that's happening. So hopefully you can hear that there's some stuttering where there didn't used to be. There's a little bit of it. It's not going, it's keeping the underlying pulse the same, and it's keeping the sort of rhythm the same, but it's just putting in some silences where there had been drum beats before. And it's kind of a nice way to add in some variation that keeps the rhythm different over time, right? It's not just the same thing over and over again. And it also helps to do this with, say, you know, combine this with the angle bracket syntax, and then you have something that is just continuously varying. Like every cycle, it's, you know, it keeps changing over and over and over again, and that kind of just has a good feel to it. And this is also pretty useful for I think it's a good thing to do when you almost put in more beats than you would want in a cycle. Like you keep the underlying pulse. Like say, let's have, rather than 4 or 8 hi-hats, let's include 16. Except that let's put in the question mark, which means that it's going to only be, like, we're expecting about 8 of them to play per thing, but it'll sort of shift around and keep changing a lot. And this is an effect I kind of like and think is pretty useful for getting variation in music really fast. Okay, so I think that's, in fact, actually is for this outro, let's go ahead and keep the little tick of the hi-hat going because I kind of like the way it sounds. So this is the end of the first tutorial video. I hope it was helpful. Tune in for the next video, which is going to be a little more on constructing patterns. We're going to start getting into melodies and how to choose notes and doing fun stuff along that. So until next time, have fun and try making music.